After studying this module, we shall be able to identify the different theoretical explanations of foreign direct investment flows in the global economy. Examine the differences between the rationale of FDI behavior from the developed versus the developing world. Understand the trends and patterns of FDI flows in the global economy. Distinguish between different forms of FDI flows in the developed versus developing country context.
The rapid growth of world population since 1950 has occurred mostly in developing countries. This growth has been matched by more rapid increases in gross domestic product, and thus the income per capita has increased in most countries around the world since 1950. An increase in FDI may be associated with improved economic growth due to the influx of capital and increased tax revenues for the host country. Host countries often try to channel the foreign direct investment into new infrastructure and other projects to boost development. Greater competition from new companies can lead to productivity gains and greater efficiency in the host country. And it has been suggested that the application of a foreign entity policies to a domestic subsidiary may improve the corporate governance standards. Furthermore, foreign investment can result in the transfer of soft skills through training and job creation, the availability of more advanced technology for domestic markets, and access to research and development resources. The local population may be able to benefit from the employment opportunities created by the new business. In this module, we shall discuss the different theoretical explanation of foreign direct investment flows in the global economy, the differences between the rationale of foreign direct investment behavior from the developed versus the developing markets, the trends and the patterns of foreign direct investment flows in the global economy, and distinguish between the different forms of foreign direct investment flows in the developed versus developing country context.
FDI is a mode of foreign entry in which a firm invests directly in production or other facilities over which it has effective control. Increasing competition constantly drives firms to improve efficiency and reduce production costs by investing in low cost sources of capital, natural resources, energy, and labor. These are the driving factors that push a firm towards international production in order to improve its competitive advantage in the global economy. Let us begin with understanding the different theoretical explanations of FDI. Industrial organization theory, put forth by Hamer, explains FDI as a means of transferring knowledge and firm assets, both tangible and tacit, in order to organize production abroad. OLI framework was propounded by John H. Dunning in 1958. According to the OLI framework, firms undertake FDI when it has certain unique ownership advantages that it want to exploit in foreign location and which it cannot do more profitably than through internationalization. Internationalization is the firm's response to imperfect and poorly functioning market where transaction cost of arm's length transaction is relatively higher. R.H. Coase, in his transaction cost theory, proposed that firms undertake FDI when external market fails to provide an efficient environment in which firms can profit by using its technology, know-how, brand name, or production process. Hence, all the traditional theories explaining FDI proposes that possession of unique competitive advantage is quintessential for the firms to undertake FDI. Uppsala model explains the pattern of FDI. It posits that initial investment is made by the firms in the geographically and culturally proximate markets. As the experience accumulates, larger investments are made into countries distant on both counts.
Let us discuss the different theoretical explanation of foreign direct investment. Industrial organization approach. Stephen Hammer and Charles Kindleberger explained the foreign direct investment as a means of transferring the knowledge and the firm's asset, both tangible and tacit, in order to organize the production abroad. It explained that the firms were able to invest in unfamiliar foreign markets since they possess unique capabilities such as differentiated products, marketing skills, proprietary technology, managerial skills, access to capital and government imposed market distortions which give them the certain unique advantage in an oligopolistic market. Transaction cost theory. The transaction cost theory puts forth the similar explanation of foreign direct investment. R. H. Coase, in his transaction cost theory, explained the foreign direct investment as an organizational response to the external market failures. The firms undertake the foreign direct investment when the external market fails to provide an efficient environment in which the firms can profit by using its technology, know-how, brand name or the production process. The firm therefore produces an internal market via investment in multiple countries and thus creates the needed market to achieve its objectives. Internationalization takes place because either there is no market for the intermediate products needed by the transnational corporations or because the external market for such products is inefficient. The cost of transactions in the external market may also be higher than the transaction within the intra-organizational market. Hence, the incentive to internalize the activity is to avoid the disadvantages in external mechanisms of resource allocation and to benefit from the internally integrated and intra-organizational network. The eclectic paradigm, that is OLI framework. John Dunning combined the earlier theoretical explanations into the OLI framework. According to this, the firm undertakes the foreign direct investment when it has certain unique ownership advantages, the firm's specific advantages, and it exploits in a foreign location. Dunning refined the possession of a proprietary resources and the capabilities into the asset-based ownership advantages which are realized from the structural market imperfections and the transaction-based ownership advantages which are realized from the transaction imperfections. The theory states that at any given time, the stock of the foreign assets owned by a transnational corporations is determined by a combination of firm-specific or ownership advantages, the extent of location-bound endowments, that is L, and the extent to which these advantages are marketed, internalized within the various units of the firm. Uppsala model. Further, in 1977, Johnson and Velu puts forward the Uppsala model, which posits that the multinational MNEs engaged in foreign direct investment incrementally making small investment in geographically and the cultural proximate markets. Initially, as an experience accrues, the larger investment are made into the countries distant on both counts.
The limitation of traditional theoretical framework are challenger firms or latecomers are the firms from developing countries that start small, lack key sources and are distant from major markets. The rise of multinationals from emerging markets like India, China, Brazil and Turkey expose the weakness and limitations of existing theories of FDI in explaining the rise of challengers and latecomers. The internationalization of these firms took place due to unconventional ownership advantages and the non-existence of a strong prior resource base rather than the exploitation of superior existing O advantages as argued by traditional FDI theory. Let us now discuss the theoretical framework of analyzing FDI behavior of latecomers or challengers. The firms from developing countries draw advantages from their developing country context, including flexibility, low overheads, and cost effectiveness. These firms have an advantage in the use of networks and relationships, organizational structures, leverage of cultural ties or institutional affinity, and other heterogeneous source of potential advantage. To explain the FDI behavior of firms from newly industrialized countries, John Matthews propounded the Triple L theory, which is based on unconventional O advantages of challenger firms. The theory asserts that Asian challenger firms, given their ability to leverage resources in networks, create linkages in foreign markets to access or acquire complementary assets and resources. The repeated application of linkage and leverage process result in organizational learning, which helps firms to perform such operations more effectively and consolidate its position in foreign market. Strategic linkage and organizational learning theory posits that firms undertake FDI not only when they possess firm specific advantages for asset exploitation, but also when they seek technology based resources and skills that are not available in the home country environment to overcome existing competitive disadvantages and build and enhance existing capabilities. Springboard perspective and leapfrogging theory explains FDI from the similar viewpoint. Leapfrogging, however, does not entail the recursive or revolving dimensions of international operations and is only a part of complex and revolving process of international expansion. Springboard, on the other hand, seeks more extensive strategic gains beyond latecomer advantages and links a firm's international expansion with its home base. Why do firms undertake FDI? What is the rationale behind making FDI? Firms undertake FDI when they are motivated to do so. Motives or the drivers are the factors that trigger companies' internationalization or further expansion. Market seeking FDI is primarily driven by the desire of the firms to expand their market shares in a foreign location. Other factors driving market seeking FDI are the need to follow customers in host countries, produce products close to local markets so as to adapt to local tastes and preferences, preempting the competitors and circumventing the trade barriers. Resource seeking FDI is said to be undertaken when firms invest overseas to acquire cheaper resources including physical, human, technological or organizational resources. FDI is driven by effective seeking motive when firms invest overseas to increase their cost effectiveness by taking advantage of differences in the cost of factor endowment economic system and by achieving economies of scale and scope. Created asset seeking FDI is driven by the firm's desire to sustain and enhance its international competitiveness by acquiring strategic assets such as R&D or technological know-how, patents, brand names, permits and licenses, and extensive network of distribution. According to UNCTAD Global Survey 2006, developing and developed country counterparts within same industry are likely to pursue different motives of FDI. For example, in oil, gas and extraction, whereas most developed country TNCs undertake FDI for resource seeking reasons, many developing country counterparts are primarily investing overseas to open or secure markets since they already have access to the raw materials.
According to UNCTAD Global Survey 2006, the market seeking motive is the most significant motive of foreign direct investment from developing countries, especially for transnational corporations from South Africa, India, and China. Market seeking foreign direct investment from developing countries is targeted at neighboring countries for the reason of proximity and familiarity, as also to the developed countries, mainly due to their sheer market size. In the same survey, created asset seeking was found to be the least important motive of FDI from the developing countries owing to weak absorptive capacities. The motive of FDI varies within the same industries depending on the host country. For example, in oil, gas and extraction industries, most developed countries, transnational corporations undertake the foreign direct investment for resource seeking reasons. Many developing country counterparts are primarily investing overseas to open or secure the markets. Since then already have access to the raw materials, the diversity of motives is also observed among the developing countries' transnational corporations. While market seeking and resource seeking foreign direct investment is the most significant motive for transnational corporations from India, China, and South Africa, the efficiency seeking foreign direct investment is relatively unimportant for Chinese and South African transnational corporations due to continuing relatively low cost in their respective home economies. While for Chinese transnational corporations created, asset seeking is the second most important motive of FDI. The motive is relatively unimportant for South America, for South Africa and Indian transnational corporations.
Before discussing trends in FDI, it is important to distinguish between the FDI flows and FDI stock. FDI flows refer to the amount of investment undertaken over a given period of time, whereas FDI stock refers to the total accumulated value of foreign owned assets at a given point of time. As it can be seen from the graph, the flow of FDI has majorly shown the upward trend, but there have been variations in upward trend of global FDI flows. The annual FDI outflow increased from 51 billion US dollars in 1980 to around 1.2 trillion US dollars in 2004 before falling back to 904 billion US dollars in 2005, although it recovered soon in the following years after reaching the historic high of 2272 billion US dollars in 2007. Global FDI outflow fell down to 2005 billion US dollars in 2008, the year of global financial crisis. Global FDI flows dampened in the following year and showed signs of recovery in the first half of 2010. In 2011, global FDI outflows recorded an increase of 16% rising to 1.7 trillion US dollars, surpassing the 2005 to 2007 pre-crisis level for the first time. The strong recovery observed in 2011 could not last long and was followed by 17% decline in global FDI flows in the following year, owing to decline on outward FDI by developed countries. Let us now move on to study the directions of FDI across the world. Historically, major share of the world FDI flows were dominated by the developed economies of the world as the firms based in advanced nations invested in others' market. Developed economies accounted for 75% and 68% of global FDI inflows during 1980s and 1990s and 1990s to 2000 respectively. The United States has often been the favorite target for FDI inflows.
The United States has often been the favorite target for foreign direct investment inflows, receiving on an average 34% of global foreign direct investment flows during 1980 to 1990. United States remained dominant recipient throughout 1990s, that is 20% of the global FDI inflows. In 2000, the United States was again the largest recipient of foreign direct investment, accounting for $314 billion of $1.2 trillion in global foreign direct investment. US have been preferred foreign direct investment destination due to its huge market size, dynamic and stable economy, and a favorable political and economic environment. The geographic distribution of the global FDI inflows for the period of 1980 to 2000. Even though the developed nations still account for the dominant share of foreign direct investment inflows, the foreign direct investment into the developing nations has increased. The foreign direct investment into the developing nations increased from 7 billion US dollars in 1980 to 64 US billion dollars in 2000 to 703 US billion dollars in 2012. Developing economies' share in the global FDI has increased remarkably after 2008 financial crisis, accounting for 46% of the global FDI flows during 2009 to 2012. The geographic distribution of the global FDI inflows during 2000 to 2012. Most inflows into the developing nations have been targeted at emerging economies of Southeast and Southeast Asia, particularly China. The other important region that has been favored FDI destination is the Latin America and Caribbean. Average inflows in the region were recorded at $136 billion during 2000 to 2012. The increasing share of developing economies in the global FDI flows is explained by economic and political changes occurring in many developing countries of the world. The general shift towards the democratic political institutions, free market economy, and liberalization of FDI policy regime has encouraged the FDI.
As can be seen from the chart, major share of FDI inflows during 1980 to 2000 went to developed countries. Developing countries accounted for mere 28% of the world inflows. This can be partly explained by restrictive investment policies adopted by developing countries. As can be seen from the chart, while developed countries still account for more than half of global FDI inflows, share of developing countries has increased. As compared to 28% of global FDI inflows during 1980 to 2000, developing nations now account for sizable 37% of inflows. This trend indicates increasing integration of developing countries, particularly the emerging economies of South, East, and Southeast Asia, into the global economy. Even though developed nations still account for the dominant share of FDI inflows, share of developing countries is on the rise. FDI into developing nations increased from 7 billion US dollars in 1980 to 264 billion US dollars in 2000 to 703 billion US dollars in 2012. Developing economies' share in global FDI has increased remarkably after 2008 financial crisis, accounting for 46% of global FDI flows during 2009 to 2012. Most inflows into the developing nations have been targeted at the emerging economies of South, East, and Southeast Asia, particularly China. The other important region that has become favored FDI destination is the Latin America and Caribbean. Average inflows in the region were recorded at 136 billion US dollars during 2000 to 2012. The increasing share of developing economies in global FDI flows is explained by economic and political changes occurring in many developing countries of the world. The general shift towards the democratic political institutions, free market economy, and liberalization of FDI policy regime has encouraged FDI. When a firm decides to invest abroad, it has to choose the mode of entry or the mode of making investment in a foreign country. Various modes of operating in a foreign market are greenfield investment, cross-border mergers and acquisition, joint venture, and exporting. Greenfield investment is the form of FDI where firm sets up fully owned new facilities in the foreign market. In merger and acquisition, firm acquires or purchases an established local firm in the foreign market. Merging with an already established firm is less costly and safe mode of investing in a foreign market. It gives the investing firm instant access to the strategic assets such as technology, R&D, brand names, customers, distribution network owned by the acquired entity. Joint venture involves collaborating or cooperating with a local firm on a particular project in a foreign market. Exporting is known as arm's length mode of servicing a foreign market. Goods are produced in home country and are sold abroad through distributors in the desired foreign market.
The data suggest that the majority of the cross-border investment in the form of mergers and acquisition rather than greenfield investment. A preference of mergers and acquisition over the greenfield investments have been observed over the past 2 decades or so, particularly in the context of developed countries. Since the fair valuations of mergers and acquisition depend on the efficiency of the financial markets, the financial crisis of 2008 resulted in relatively larger decline in the number of cross-border mergers and acquisition deals, 34%, then a decline in the number of greenfield investment projects, that is 15%. But this does not indicate the long-term reversal of the preference of mergers and acquisitions as the dominant mode of foreign direct investment with respect to 2010. However, during 2012, the value of the greenfield investments, that is $612 billion, outgrew the value of the cross borders and mergers and acquisitions to US $308 billion in both developed and developing countries.
Choice of entry mode is determined in part by the country in which the firm wishes to invest. According to United Nations Cooperation on Trade and Development's data during 1990 to 2012, on an average, only 19% of total cross-border mergers and acquisition sales were recorded in the developing countries. This reflects the fact that there are fewer target firms to acquire in developing nations. UNCTAD statistics on cross-border M&A suggests that the share of M&A transactions in developing economies is on the rise. Between 1990 and 2012, the share of global cross-border M&A rose from 19% to 16% in value terms and from 6% to 24% in terms of number of deals concluded. It is evident from the table that although the share of developing countries in M&A transactions is on the rise, developed nations still dominate. It can be therefore concluded that M&A is the most preferred mode of entry in context of developed markets. Mergers and acquisitions are preferred over greenfield investments on account of following reasons. M&A are quicker and cheaper to execute. Acquiring an existing firm in host country provides immediate access to strategic assets such as R&D or technological know-how, patents, brand names, local permits and licenses, supplier or distribution networks which may not be available elsewhere and take time to develop. Also, M&A allows participating firms to realize synergies in various operations.
However, the foreign direct investment flows into the developed nations differ widely from those into developing nations. During 1990 to 2012, on an average, only 19% of the total cross-border mergers and acquisitions sales were recorded in developing countries. This reflects the fact that there are very fewer target firms to acquire in developing nations. UNCTAD statistics on the cross borders and mergers and acquisitions suggest that the shares of the mergers and acquisition transactions in developing and transition economies is on the rise. Between 1990 to 2012, their share of the global cross-border mergers and acquisitions rose from 9% to 16% in value terms and from 6% to 24% in terms of number of deals concluded, still modest as compared to developed economies though.
With respect to greenfield investments, data suggests that both developed and developing countries attract almost equal share of total number of investments made. However, developing economies attracted more greenfield investments during 2004 to 2005 and 2008 to 2009. The upswing in FDI flows to developing countries in 2004 was mainly associated with Greenfield Investments, notably in Asia. China and India together accounted for about half of all new registered Greenfield projects in developing countries. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. We have learnt about the theoretical frameworks explain FDI behavior of firms from both developing and developed countries. While the FDI behavior of developed country firms can be explained from asset exploiting perspective, investment behavior of developing country firms can be explained from asset seeking or asset augmenting perspective. Historically, major share of FDI flows were dominated by developed countries. During 2000 to 2012, although the share of developing countries has increased and is on the rise, more than half of FDI inflows are still targeted towards developed parts of the world in the form of mergers and acquisitions. Developing and developed nation counterparts differ not only in terms of quantum of FDI received but also exhibit varied motives of investing in a particular foreign location.